Hey all, it's Macabre Derek here, and we're going to try something a little bit new, side series as it were. It is VTM, creating your own city. Now, the city is the quintessential focus of just about every single Vampire the Masquerade campaign you'll have. Every relation, every story, every plot, every hiccup, every nuance always ends up starting at the core with the city. Now, at the head of this city, you have a prince, you have the primogen, you have ranking members with titles and all these other kind of things to end up building it up. But before you even start that, you're going to want to end up starting to wonder what's the scope of your campaign. A lot of people end up making this mistake. I'm expecting into building a city that's a million, 2 million people and just absolutely huge. I'm going to make it absolutely massive and trying to build a city very close to, something like New York or Dallas, large metropolitan areas. One of the things that will happen, however, is that when you end up designing a city that large, what typically ends up happening is that everything else starts to get watered down. You want to end up putting as much detail into that city as you can without losing a lot of the focus. And here's what I've seen happen beforehand. Some people will end up playing something that is absolutely huge, and then maybe one or two characters are really well fleshed out. On occasion, you deal with the prince, and then the rest of it all just starts to crumble. And why is this? Because the scope is absolutely huge, but the level of detail, the amount of things going on, is actually relatively small and starts to end up making the player characters actually less and less important actually in the major scope of things. Keep in mind, this is not a Dungeons and Dragons adventure, right? Where you start going across sprawling landscapes. Now, I know several people, I include myself in this, who have built worlds from scratch. And that ends up working out quite well for them. But these are people who have started with one continent, built it up, started with another location, built it up, another location. They have run probably 7 or 8 different games, all set in this same location. I myself ended up hosting Winnipeg by Night as a, shall I end up saying, more of a personal venue. It's a city I've come to know fairly well, and I've developed a lot of detail and nuance in it. But it itself is actually not that big of a city. So, how big should your city be? Well, that depends on what kind of campaign you're running. If you plan on building a campaign that you suspect might last a year, or maybe is what you're where you set your one shots, or generally a very small period of time, it actually helps to end up making that city as small as possible. I know that that doesn't sound like it's particularly grandiose, but there's a lot of things to consider when you have a large city. It's about one vampire for every 50,000 populace. It's enough that if something goes wrong, it doesn't immediately come back to you. This is when people see strange things, an individual who may be unconscious in an alley after a shadow is looming over them. You might end up seeing, did those look like fangs? Who would believe them? Large enough. Now, on the other hand, if it's a very small town, well, I just end up seeing Jethro end up pulling out Ned's throat with his teeth. I know exactly who the fuck that is, and he knows exactly who I am, and he knows who I'm attached to, and then it just ends up turning into a very large cluster for that particular vampire. Safety comes in larger populations. This is one of the reasons why it is Typically, one for smaller cities, one for every 100,000, and one for every 50,000 medium to large size cities. Now, the larger you scale that city, the more time you intend to be playing in it. Simple example. If I start with a one-shot, fairly railroady campaign, I need to know the prince, the primogen of the or the primogens of the PCs. I need to know who the antagonist is, and maybe 5 or 6 individuals who are really well fleshed out. That's enough content to run a session for 8 hours, possibly more. What happens if you want to end up going a little bit beyond that? Say you're running a weekly game and you're figure, we'll just play in it until it burns out. Well, small to medium-sized cities actually work better for that. And I know it's kind of one of those, well, why not do a large city? Because I want to do a campaign that's going to run for like 5 years. Here's the thing. I have rarely seen campaigns run that long. I've seen them run for several years, but I've never seen a campaign run for 5 years or longer and maintain its, I should say, balance. Now, keep in mind, I might be the exception to the rule here. Many of you may have actually been playing in campaigns that have run 5-10 years. Completely plausible. And I would end up asking then, where did the interest come from? So, when you start to hear city, let's start a city right now. In fact, let's think about this. I'm going to build a city specifically there to set one-shots and maybe a 1-year campaign. So I'm going to make this a small to medium-sized city. How many people? Let's say maybe about little over 250,000, so say 30,000 people. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of room for Kindred, given the numbers I've given you, now does it? No, that 30,000. We're doing maybe. Sorry, 300,000 would probably be more accurate. Brain numbers don't work for me. So at 300,000, you got 3 to 6, maybe 7 Kindred if you're pushing it. Why this ratio? Well, first of all, you have to consider the role of a prince. We'll end up getting into details on princes later, but just a quick consideration. A prince is not only the most powerful kindred, but what he is effectively a regulator. He is there to keep his city from boiling over. Now, if a lone kindred ends up doing a city of that size, well, there's that social aspect that will eventually start to creep in. Your vampire will want to end up getting close to somebody at that point. I mean, the world at this point just seems to ebb and wane, so eventually he's going to want to end up dealing with somebody. There's also going to be the potential of a rival that eventually shows up at that city. People are eventually going to start to flood in, and guess what? If it's not claimed, if it's not regulated, well, they're just going to start taking up power, resources, start to gain bits of control. And think about this: if you're the prince, you want to control it all. You have staked this claim, so you need to end up making sure that you are well connected with your city. Not only well connected in politics, but in almost every other facet. But with the restriction of how long you can be awake and actually manipulating the strings, well, you're going to need some help. You're going to need allies. You're going to need contacts. You're going to need retainers. You're going to need people who can get the job done for you, which means you're not doing everything directly. And the more indirect you become, the more you realize that you're separating yourself from humanity, from socializing. If most of your evenings are spent in a boardroom with your ghouls and allies, discussing how to end up maintaining the city and how to end up pushing its course. Keep in mind, most vampires are not powerful enough to simply snap their fingers and guess what? This city has now changed course. No, no, they do subtle influences, just enough to push and change things by a degree or two. They're long-term planners, so it might take 50 years for a Ancilla to end up being able to push the course of a city to a different location. Maybe wanting to end up bringing in tourism. Tourism is really good if you want to end up bringing in a feeding supply where nobody knows them and nobody cares. It's cruel, but true. It's a very beneficial bit. You want them to come in and benefit your city, have a chance to feed, and then have them ship off home where you don't have to worry about them. To maintain this kind of control means that you're going to need help. The larger the city, the more help you're going to need, which means the more favors you're going to need to give out, and the more you're going to have to make sure you're a linchpin. You're in this position of power. So maybe this prince starts off with a childer. Okay, so right there, we got 2 kindred. So a city supporting of 300,000. We can do 1 more, maybe, and live in relative peace and harmony. I say relatively. I mean, 2 kindred trying to patrol an entire city for other kindred that may be coming in, that's pretty hard to defend. So what happens then? Well, a third shows up. Maybe an out-of-towner, maybe somebody who came in from another city and was ostracized, maybe exiled, wants to stake claim. Keep in mind, this is for very new cities, right? So he comes in. Well, okay, no rustling the feathers, but now all of a sudden you got 3 kindred, 2 allied, 1 against. Now trying to oust him out of the city might be a little bit difficult. You got a little bit of pull, but he's got some pull himself because, kindred have their tendency to get their fingers into a lot of pies, being able to end up pushing strong on a lot of different options. Maybe he's managed to cut himself a little bit of a section in the docks. Well, in order for a prince to maintain his city, he needs to keep that kindred in check. How does he do that? Maybe he uses his childer. Well, how does he use his childer? He says, childer, you have served me well, so I grant you domain. That domain just happens to be right on the outside edge of this other section of territory this third kindred may have taken to stop his expanse and say, I will support you if he ends up pushing that far. We will make that claim, and then it turns into a 2-on-1. The other vampire doesn't want to start losing favor. He doesn't want to start pushing because that's going to be bad for everybody, including himself. So, how does this childer maintain? Well, then this childer needs to start making ghouls. This childer needs to start making contacts. And this is how a city with a very minimal amount of kindred can start building up a whole bunch of NPCs, a lot of contacts, a lot of politics without a grotesque amount of kindred. While it is fun to have a place that might run like 100, 200 kindred, consider what it would be like to be in a very small, tight-knit group. Think of it almost like a prison block. Because that's very much what a city can be. You're trying to carve out your niche. You're trying to make sure that you end up holding some degree of power because you don't want to get kicked out. You want to prove yourself useful, and, well, you want to make sure that everybody's going to need you from time to time. This is how a city typically starts to get divided up. Now, when you're building the city. Consider how many divides you got to take. Simple example. Okay, right now, 30,000 people. We got 3 kindred. What could be called a prince is Childer and this one outsider who's managed to end up making a staking claim. What happens if a 4th one shows up? What does this 4th one do? Well, this 4th one looks at this city and ends up saying, well, these guys kind of end up having a fair amount of pull around here. But it's only 3 kindred. They can't control the entire city. They gotta find niches, maybe something that most didn't expect, where the others might control stuff like transit, banking, shipping. They might start looking around and start going underground. Maybe it's a case of they start gaining control of aqueducts or sewers. Maybe they start gaining control of parks and all this kind of stuff. And when I say control, I just mean that little bit of influence, not the thing that makes it bend entirely to your will, but on the fact that you can change its direction by a degree or two. And eventually, after so many years, it is off in a completely different trajectory, the one that you wanted it to be. Well, now you got a bit of a problem, because those other kindred might end up looking at this individual and say, well, why are you getting involved in our shit? This is our city. What are you doing here? The prince is thinking, I already got a rival I got to deal with and keep under control. Now I got another one. But what if I pit them against each other? What if I say, okay, you want to be a part of my city? Yeah, that's fine. And now grant a piece of that pie, but over top of the turf of the other one. Now, all of a sudden, the childer of the prince needs to end up making it. This is how politics starts getting really complicated. And that's a good thing. Because try and imagine, even with just these 4 kindred, right? Just these 4. And now all of a sudden introduce 3 neonates. Average coterie size. Maybe they were ousted from another city. Maybe they're all the same clan, and one of these rivals said, "You want to know what? I'm going to make a power play. I'm going to embrace them all, and I'm going to bring unholy hell upon that would try and dispute my claim. Show them what kind of power I have." Ooh, big power play. Forces your PCs right in the center of it. You can't do this with a large city. Large city, there's too many individuals. Everything's chopped up, in which case, it's dealt with by the lower ends, those who are other neonates, and maybe an ancilla who's not risen to prominence yet. They slowly build in. Or as opposed to this situation, a neonate can quite easily start to end up showing bits of power. Of course, they're going to have to do some really horrible things to end up doing that, though. Because the more kindred that end up in a small city, or even a medium-sized city, the more they start to pick and try and find little tidbits, little bits of influence that the other ones haven't caught on to. They try and find ways to feed and oust and change territory. Try and find ways to curry favor with the prince and be able to expand their domains, find ways to secure those domains. Because the last thing you need is some uppity neonate feeding in your domain, trying to be secret about it, and that word gets out that people can feed on your domain with impunity. And what of the prince? The prince is perpetually looking at this and going, I need to stop this before it starts turning into an arms race where everybody's starting to embrace more and more and more just to end up making sure that they have the larger side, the more powerful side. I need to find some way to put a lid on this, is because once the Masquerade's broken and the more kindred in a tighter area, more denser population, or how should I put this? In a smaller population, larger numbers of kindred means more bodies go missing, more people start getting suspicious, more chances of a slip up. Every single kindred is a risk to the masquerade. Adding one more is an additional risk. It's a very carefully planned out piece. So when building a city, consider the size. If you want to make that expansive city, however, they're not always a bad idea. The expansive city, on the other hand, has grave swaths of power players because there needs to be. Again, try and imagine one person on their own trying to control an entire city. It's just not going to happen. Even if you do have some eldritch powers in disciplines and maybe even a good contact or two, it would be almost impossible to keep an eye on absolutely everything. But that's what a kindred tries to do, because if he doesn't, somebody's going to come in that one way that they didn't consider and start building a power base in their city. And then all of a sudden, what do you do? What do you do without making a huge stink of it? So, when you end up building up a city, consider its size. Not only population, but its actual physical size. Because if it's a large city that is built wide, you'll find huge expanses of space where there's very little going on, except for minor highways that are barely a kilometer or a mile long and connects to the next section. But it all goes under one jurisdiction. You might have locations that seem very close knit and built high, in which case it feels more akin to something like Tokyo, where you can't walk 10 feet without running into somebody. These create very different problems for a prince. These make very different problems for a neonate. These are different situations. These can set the tone of your city. So consider that city. Small is intimate. Medium is flexible. Large is overwhelming. These aren't bad. These are separate tones just by the size of the city you are creating.